We continue the football discussion as we bring in the CFL on TSN's Duane Forde, longtime friend of ours, and I've always called him Canada's Mel Kiper, draft expert. Good morning, Forde. How are you?
Good morning, Mr. Pedersen. How are things?
Very well, thank you. I can't say that you first came on my radar as a draft guru. Well, I knew you as a player, of course, in the CFL, but it was when you were on the score and you nailed every pick. I want to say the 06 draft-ish for the CFL, maybe 07. I think it was Fantuz's year. And I'm like, wow, this guy's a savant. 40, and it's kept up, by the way. I mean, what's your success when it comes to making draft predictions with such accuracy in the CFL?
Well, the funny thing, Rod, is I'm not much of a prediction guy. There are a lot of guys that like to do mock drafts and things like that. I'm not into mock drafts. I'm into the real thing. I like to see how the real thing turns out, quite honestly. But, part of the thing in the Canadian Football League is that it's a small league. And so, there have certainly been a lot of years where, this isn't like a magic trick. I'll let you behind the curtain, where the reality is there are just enough people that'll talk that will let you know what's happening. That there are a lot of years where, the reality is I could tell you probably the night before the draft, here's exactly how the first round is going to go. Here are the trades that are going to be made, and here's who's going to be picked. But again, that's a factor of it being a small league, not necessarily a piece of magic on my part. I guess my one part in it is that I'm a draft junkie. I love drafts. I love following drafts. I love analyzing drafts and revisiting drafts, and and just looking at what teams did, what they could have done, maybe in my mind what they should have done. And so that's the role that I play in it. But quite honestly, a lot of times in terms of knowing what's going to happen is a matter of actually knowing what's going to happen as opposed to guessing what's going to happen.
Right. Well, I know that, but that's why I always wanted to tell you that it's impressed me so much. I'm not a draft junkie. I'm a Hall of Fame junkie. That's the debates that I like to get into, and I'm sure you probably like to get into those too. But the NFL draft's got to be far easier to predict than the CFL draft because of the moving parts of the CFL draft. So maybe we'll talk about that. Can you talk about the nuances between the two? The differences?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things I love. I call this the most unique draft in sports, quite frankly, because of the fact that you look at the National Football League, the NBA, even Major League Baseball, NHL, in all of those sports, really when those leagues draft a player, the player is going to play in that league. Whereas in the Canadian Football League draft, one of the points I make about it all the time is that it's the one draft in pro sports where the best player available virtually never goes first overall, because of the NFL factor. There's another league where players have an opportunity to get paid a little bit more money. And as a result, oftentimes you will have the best guys going there. And that becomes more and more of a factor with each passing year as, quite frankly, Canadian talent tends to develop further and further. I mean, you look at the schools that Canadian players are playing their NCAA football at now, it's night and day from what it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago. The number of guys who are playing at Power 5 conference schools and making huge contributions. And so the NFL factor, and certainly the awareness of the National Football League, of the amount of talent coming from this side of the border, when you look at the youth sports kids and recognizing now that, you know what, this is kind of a gold mine worth scouting as well, which they didn't do much, a couple of decades ago, that it becomes even more of a factor in the Canadian Football League draft. So it's definitely unique in that way. And then one of the other factors as well that causes you to have more variety, again, one of those old adages, you will find more variety between 9 Canadian Football League team draft boards than you'll find between all the NFL draft boards, even though you've got 3 times as many teams, simply because of the factors at play. So again, you've got the best players often being affected by being drafted or signed as free agents or invited to mini camps by National Football League teams. But then you also put into play the fact of the ratio, and the fact that each team is going to deploy the ratio a little bit differently. And so if a position isn't a Canadian position, so to speak, on one team, they may not value a certain player in the draft, but that might be the top guy on another team's board simply because he plays a position where they have a Canadian slotted to play. And so you factor in all of these things, and it really does become not just a chess match, but a puzzle.
I know you can talk football for days and days and days. I'm going to keep you on probably to the top of the hour, if that's okay, because we have a lot of viewers writing in with questions. But I have several. And my next one is, what's the intrigue that you've identified for the 2020 CFL draft? What are the top stories, top players, that kind of thing, and needs?
Yeah, and again, still sifting through a lot of that stuff over the course of the next couple of weeks. But I think that in any year, I think that you look, as we talked about, is trying to figure out, certainly once the National Football League draft happens and you've got priority free agents starting to sign, then the intrigue for the Canadian Football League draft becomes, well, okay, which guys have signed those contracts, which guys have been invited to mini camps, and then kind of evaluating, okay, what are their odds of sticking down there and for how long? A lot of times you'll still draft a guy high knowing that he's going to be in a National Football League camp. You won't have him for the first half of this year. You may not have him for a year, but it's a question of, am I willing to wait a year? Am I willing to wait a year and a half? Am I willing to wait 2 or 3 years in deciding how high I'm going to draft a guy? And so there's certainly that element. One guy who a lot of people would claim as one of the top guys available in this draft is Carter O'Donnell, offensive lineman from the University of Alberta. Played very well against some of the top players in NCAA football in the Shrine game. And so that has very much put him on the NFL map, and very athletic guy, 6'5", over 300 pounds, prototypical offensive lineman, obviously. And a guy that a lot of people think, oh, here's a guy who, typically would be a number 1 overall pick type up here. But depending on what happens with him in the National Football League, it raises the question of how high will he actually go? At what point in the draft is someone going to take a guy like Carter O'Donnell? So that's a big part of it. For me, one of the storylines as well, you always hate to do it, because as a draft guy, as a fan of the league, because there are so many good Canadian players out there that you want to spend your time talking about who is here and who is available and who is going to play in the Canadian Football League. But at the same time, I think one of the storylines for me this year is, in fact, looking at the National Football League draft and realizing that you've got a couple of kids who are the best Canadian prospects, and Neville Gallimore, the defensive tackle from Oklahoma, and Chase Claypool, wide receiver from Notre Dame. Those guys are from Ottawa and from the Vancouver area, respectively. These are guys that are going to go, probably, I would guess, both probably by the second round of the National Football League draft. And so you look at taking talent like that out of our Canadian Football League draft, yet still having a pretty good looking draft pool as well.
Wow. I was just going to ask you that. Craig Smith, who you'd know well, thinks that Chase Claypool will go by the end of the second round of the CFL draft. Somebody will take a flyer on him because he's just so good. But all those Canadian guys, they're not necessarily coming back anymore 40 like they used to. Have you seen a shift there?
Yeah, well, I think part of it is that you're seeing guys last longer down there. Certainly, there's not just the cup of coffee. Obviously, guys they're gonna pursue that as long as they can, and economically, obviously, we understand the differences between the two leagues as much as we wish that it were different. But yeah, if a guy is able to get a few years down there and make pretty good money, and if he can get to a point of earning his pension down there, then obviously that's something they're going to try to do, and we're not going to begrudge anybody that either. So yeah, there are a lot of times where guys aren't coming back, and it is an economic thing, certainly. As far as Claypool going by the end of the second round, it becomes interesting. You always look for comparables in things like this. And I go back to 2012 draft, I believe it was. And it was a pretty good defensive line class that year. Realistically, the best player in that draft class, with all due respect to Ben Heenan going first overall to the Saskatchewan Roughriders, good Saskatchewan boy, it was Tyrone Crawford, defensive lineman from Boise State. He's from Windsor, Ontario, but ends up being a third-round pick, I believe, to the Dallas Cowboys that year. Tyrone Crawford didn't go at all in the Canadian Football League draft, which I looked at as sort of a testament to how good a player Tyrone Crawford was, that nobody saw fit through the entire CFL draft to even take a chance on him. Because normally, as you said, at some point, somebody is going to take these guys just to have the rights because they're such good players. For me, I do think that there are some decent receivers in this draft that I'm not sure, as good as Chase Claypool is, I'm not sure that somebody takes a shot at him that high simply because it could be a while.
Do the draft gurus in Canada have it right? Jordan Williams from East Carolina, the linebacker, is the number one prospect, do you think, to Calgary, or have you identified somebody else?
I look at it a little differently, and I love the work that all the other guys do covering the draft. It's exciting to me, and I'll apologize in advance for going off on a bit of a tangent here, but I've had this conversation a couple of times this year that, for me, I've been to the CFL Combine, covered the draft every year since 2005, and I am quite confident that I'm certainly the only media guy that has done that. When I started off, I was kind of the only guy covering the draft. But as a guy who loves drafts, I love the fact that lots of other people are covering it, lots of other people are writing about it. Jordan Williams is unique, and this is one of the things that I think makes him such a good prospect. The draft, a lot of times for me, it's football economics, it's supply and demand. What makes Jordan Williams unique is that athletically, I would say you get a linebacker like Jordan Williams who may come along once every 5 years. This is a guy who is one of the fastest players in the draft at 220 pounds, one of the strongest players in the draft. Just no question, he's an elite athlete. And this is one of the things that you'll find divides, is kind of the dividing line for Canadian linebackers, very good Canadian university linebackers in terms of being able to be starters in the Canadian Football League or special teams players. Jordan Williams is so unique, so athletic in that regard. I think it's going to take a little bit of time for him to sort of pick up the nuances of the CFL game. This is a guy who didn't grow up here, hasn't experienced Canadian football much. So there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve, but he's a guy who's been through that before. But supply and demand, and, obviously the fact of maybe thinking in terms of, we've had Alex Singleton as a Canadian middle linebacker who can change the ratio. We've had Corey Greenwood as a Canadian linebacker who allows us to do that. That in some ways, for Calgary, certainly that makes sense. I'm not convinced necessarily that Williams goes number one overall, but I can certainly see where that reasoning comes from.
This is going far too fast. I got to get to the viewer questions.
I talk too much. I know.
No, it just, people are just like hanging on everything because nobody else is talking about it. From Brad Hercina says, Duane, who are the biggest busts in the CFL draft over the years? You want to go down that road?
Oh, that's a tough one for me. I don't necessarily like to go busts as much because it sounds very personal and insulting. And I don't want to do that in a realm where I prefer to be promoting the players. But there have definitely been some bad picks, and I've told some of those stories in the past. There was one year, 2007, I believe, where the Edmonton Eskimos took a kicker, Warren Keane, second overall in the draft, but then continued on in that season to trade another first-round pick to Toronto to get Noah Prefontaine to help solve their kicking woes. And, I think that whether Sean Fleming ended up coming back out of retirement or something, but they went through a lot of issues with it that year, that to have picked a guy second overall. And a lot of times, this is why sometimes, Rod, I don't like to get too involved in the speculation of what's going to happen in a small league, because I think sometimes people pay attention to the speculation, or they think anything you speculate on that you're speaking from a point of knowledge, where that's not always the case. Sometimes speculation is just speculation. I think Edmonton picked Warren Keane second overall because they really thought that somebody else was going to take him high. And this was a player, you had the need for the player at the position, but the fact is you could have gotten the player probably at least a couple rounds later because nobody else was actually going to take him. So that's one that I'll put out there. Sorry to offend the kicking community, and it has nothing to do with Warren Keane himself. It's just a matter of you want to get the most out of your picks, and why take a guy that high in the draft that you could get later.
Right, but you've hit on something very important. It depends on the landscape of the league at the time. Now we're flush with kickers. There's too many kickers for teams. And back then, there weren't enough kickers, right?
Yeah, well, and one of the things I'll point out too, and again, over years of doing this, I have come up with certain, I'm not going to call them, rules necessarily in my mind, but almost guidelines that I've come to go by just through a kind of a history at this point of covering the draft. Is one of the ones for me is don't use high picks on kickers. The only one that you've seen a handful of kickers picked in the first couple of rounds of the draft over the last decade or so. And I would say realistically, the only one that has worked out relative to where he has been picked has been Rob Maver, who was picked in the first round. I think Rob was 5th overall to Calgary in 2010. But the reality is Calgary had a need for a kicker that year, and so that was why they made that move to go early. But the fact is, Rob Maver ended up ultimately being a punter in the Canadian Football League. He was seen as a guy who could do all 3 jobs, and given the opportunity, I think Rob could have done all 3 jobs. But Rob ended up being a punter, being one of the best punters in the Canadian Football League during his entire career. But the reality is that when the Calgary Stampeders drafted Rob, they drafted him because they needed a place kicker. And so even that, when you say, well, it worked out that they picked him, the guy played with the team for a decade. Yeah, but he wasn't doing the job that they picked him to do. You look around the league, most of the kickers in the Canadian Football League, most of the Canadian kickers, some of them very good, are guys, whether they've come through junior football or have been free agents, later round picks. Some of the guys who have been higher picks, like a guy like Hugh O'Neill, sometimes those guys have had to bounce around for a while. So, maybe spending too much time on the Warren Keane thing, I will just close by saying you don't need to pick kickers high in the draft, because I almost don't think there's enough of an understanding of the position for it to make sense that a lot of times good guys will shake down.
You're so Canadian, Forde. Apologize. Tripping over yourself. Apologize. Stop
I don't
apologizing.
Want to hurt anybody's feelings.
Yeah, exactly. People are loving it. But in the minute that we have left, Nelson wants to know which prospect can make the biggest impact right away this season in your mind.
Wow, that's a tough one for me, because again, it depends so much, and I hate to skirt the question, but it depends on who comes available, right? You look at some of the offensive linemen. Again, going back to Carter O'Donnell at the University of Alberta. Here's a guy who could probably step in and play. Tomas Jack Kudila from University of Buffalo, probably a guy who could step in and play, but I'm not sure if these guys might have NFL opportunities that will prevent them from being there at the start of the year. And then obviously, even if they're released after training camp and come north, once you've missed camp, it becomes a little bit tougher to jump right into a starting position when you've missed camp and the background learning of that and so on. And so it's a tough question, but how about we check in a little bit closer to the draft? I might have an answer for you on that one.
Oh, perfect. Good. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this as much as we have. Right, guys?
I certainly have. Yeah. Thank you for having me.
And I think we could go longer next time. We'll see. But this has been great. My best to the family. Sherry, of course, and the rest. Stay safe, Duane. Great to see you. And we'll chat soon.
Thank you, Rod. Always a pleasure, my friend.
CFL draft guru, Duane Forde from the CFL on TSN.
You're watching Rod Pedersen On Demand. For more of The Rod Pedersen Show, visit rodpedersen.com or follow Rod Pedersen on social media.